Hi, On Orbit listeners. We have a very topical episode for you this week, looking at space policy and space issues in the 2024 election. Maybe you're like me, but I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately about the election, so we're bringing you our own election episode. I'm joined by fellow VIA editor and chair of the Satellite Show, Jeff Hill, for a conversation with Svetla Ben-Itzhak, who is an assistant professor of space and international relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Svetla recently wrote a piece for The Conversation about the implications of Elon Musk's endorsement of Donald Trump for U.S. space exploration and defense. And just this week, news came out that Elon Musk has donated $75 million to his own political action committee that is working to elect Donald Trump. Svetla talks about the markers of President Biden's space policy and what space policy could look like in a Kamala Harris administration and a second Trump term. We also dig into the idea of Musk working in or advising a second Trump administration and the thorny conflict of interest issues that brings up. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining today to co-host this episode. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rachel. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So we are here with Svetla Ben-Itzhak, and for an episode about space policy in the upcoming election. Svetla is an assistant professor of space and international relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and we're super excited to have her on today. Svetla, thanks for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so we're going to get into space policy in the U.S. election, but before we get started, I wanted you to just tell us a little bit more about your work and your area of focus at Johns Hopkins, and you mentioned that you do some work with the Space Force also.
Yes, I am assistant professor with the West Space Scholars Program, which is the senior level professional military education branch of the U.S. Space Force. However, the views that I will express here are my own. And I also teach courses for Johns Hopkins. In particular, I taught a course on space security last spring.
So we read your piece in The Conversation that you published a few weeks ago about the implications of Elon Musk endorsing Donald Trump and how this could impact U.S. space exploration and defense and the balance of public-private sector in space. So what inspired you? Like, what made you want to write that piece?
Actually, it was I received a request for an interview for by a newspaper. A newspaper sent me an email and wanted to ask me a few questions. And I asked, okay, what are the questions? And they sent me a list of 7 or 8 questions. And one of the questions was about Elon Musk and how he may influence U.S. space policy. And I thought about it, and I thought that's a really good question. That can, that deserves its own article because it's not enough to just answer it in a few sentences. And so I wrote that piece.
Thank you so much, Svetla, for being here with us to talk about it. Before we jump into what may happen, let's start with what we know has happened, right? Can you walk us through just some of the key accomplishments of the Biden administration space policy and what will continue in a potential Harris administration and how those approaches may differ in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just first want to sort of define. I always start with the definition, right? What a space policy is, and a space policy generally refers or explains the vision a nation has of space, of outer space, right? And the priorities it sets to achieve that vision. So U.S. space policy over the various administrations has been a mix of continuity from past administrations and various recent current directives, right? And is usually or has been usually outlined in several key documents, such as the U.S. National Space Policy or the US Space Priorities Framework, or key space policy directives, and various other official publications. So in terms of your question, the question was what defines President Biden's US space policy, and how may a potential Harris administration sort of develop its own policy, space policy. All right, so I'll start with Biden and then sort of extrapolate, right, into a potential Harris administration. So similar to past administrations, President Biden's management of the US space program and space policy has been characterized by, again, this interesting mix, a combination of continuity with previous administration and strategic shifts to sort of address emerging priorities. So I'm going to point sort of key facets of Biden's space policy, and please feel free to interrupt me. And I mean, if I'm going too general, I can give specific examples. But first, I'm sorry. First, Biden has has continued with the Artemis program, which aims to return humans to the moon, and that was started under President Trump with Space Policy Directive Number 1 in 2017. And so Biden has continued support for the Artemis Accords, which are agreements basically with other nations about peaceful lunar exploration and resource use. Currently, there are 45 countries signatories of the Artemis Accords, and I'm happy to report that actually Estonia became the last one, 45th country to join, just like 3 days ago on October the 13th. So this is number one, continuity. Number two, Biden has continued emphasizing and has placed a high priority on strengthening international partnerships, both through NASA and various diplomatic channels, right? To make sure that space exploration and space security remain collaborative rather than confrontational. And this again aligns with Trump's Space Policy Directive 1, which specifically called for commercial and international partnerships. Then Biden, in terms of space security and military focus, right? Biden has maintained and reinforced the role of the US Space Force established under President Trump, and made sure that its mission to protect US interests in space and to maintain US leadership in the space domain remains. So this actually reflects a growing focus on the militarization of space. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that, but this is particularly salient in the face of growing competition or perceived growing competition from Russia and China. Now, Biden has also made significant efforts, and I'll mention Harris in a second, to develop norms for responsible behavior in space, including proposal for preventing anti-satellite weapon tests and reducing the risk of conflict in space. And this is where Vice President Kamala Harris actually back in April of 2022 announced a unilateral moratorium pledging that the United States would not conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite tests. And then finally, I will point out another sort of continuation from previous administrations. Biden has continued to support and to foster the so-called public-private partnerships, particularly with companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, but many, many others, which involves sort of maintaining both competitive and innovative commercial space markets, right, for space exploration, satellite deployment, and also space tourism. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that. Now, what is new and what is different with the Biden administration from previous administrations in terms of space policy is an increased focus on emphasis on the role of space-based technologies and how to use them to address climate change and to conduct better Earth observation, right? Yeah. So Biden's administration has increased investments in NASA's Earth Science Program, for example, using satellites for climate monitoring, for disaster response, for environmental protection, for various services, right? That sort of emphasize or address climate change.
So adjustments back to
in doing that, actually, Biden has linked national security with environmental security, which is new. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So adjustments back to the Obama administration era, where you had Air Force investing in more climate-centric missions, and which makes sense. Right. As sort of like more of a hybrid of some of the programs established by President Trump with the director, the mission of the Obama administration. One thing I want to do before you jump into Kamala Harris's plan was, I'm glad you made the distinction between what is a platform and what is a policy, right? The Democratic platform is very generic, right? And it says, and this is the stuff that usually gets covered in the news, supporting NASA, right, going back to the moon, so on and so forth. One thing that was interesting in reading Kamala Harris's policy plan was the use of the word clarity on international law, norms, policies, and standards. I'm just wondering, is that clarity a signal of change that may have happened because of Russia, of the continued aggression in Ukraine, changing dynamics with China? What is your take on that?
So Vice President Harris has generally pushed, yes, the use of clarity may actually indicate the increased emphasis of the Biden administration in general on norms and dialogue in the space domain, right? So that might be the impetus for the inclusion of clarity in her policy. But so generally, actually, if Kamala Harris, I just wanted to mention something, because it did happen under Biden, and it is quite it's quite significant. But the Biden administration has also supported the creation of a civilian-led space situational awareness architecture by transferring the so-called SSA, like space situational awareness responsibilities, from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce, in particular the Office of Space Commerce, right, to provide SSA services to commercial and international partners. So this is also a shift that occurred under Biden. So switching on to what a potential Kamala Harris administration would do in terms of space policy. So it is likely that her administration would continue many of the core elements of Biden's space policy, but some nuances may emerge. So if I could elaborate a little bit. So we can expect, for example, a continuity in multilateral cooperation. And I think this is where also the clarity comes in. Also, transparency is often used. So as vice president, for example, as vice president, this is the role of vice president to chair the National Space Council, right? But as such, she has shown a commitment to international cooperation in space exploration and space security. So we can expect that her administration would continue those efforts and maybe amplify the diplomatic focus on fostering a responsible behavior in space. As I said, she announced a unilateral moratorium indicating the U.S. commitment not to use destructive assets in space. Also, we could expect her to continue her support for the growth of the commercial space sector, right? Mm-hmm. However, given her interest in tech policy and environmental justice and climate change, etc., we could expect that there would be an increased emphasis on how space technologies can address, for example, domestic social and economic changes, such as broadband access through satellite constellations, and etc., right? So the focus can be a little bit different. So Harris has also been very vocal about environmental issues, and she may prioritize space programs, for example, that directly support climate change, such as Earth observation satellites, as well as international collaboration on climate data sharing.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed in her in the interview she's given, and not necessarily in terms of space, but she has talked a lot about wanting to foster startups and invest in American innovation. So
Right.
I think that, I think commercial space companies are probably hearing a willingness from her that a Kamala Harris administration will want to work with startups and invest in commercial capabilities.
Yes, this is a great point, Rachel, and I think she will emphasize that aspect, right? Helping commercial space startups sort of take off and develop with, I think, with a special focus on Earth observation and climate change, considering her priorities, right? However, I think the most significant shift may occur in sort of the military security, space security aspect, right? She's likely to continue to maintain the U.S. Space Force and its broader focus on space security. However, she might put more emphasis on on arms control efforts in space, on multilateral efforts to curb the weaponization of space, for example, right? So this could include advocating for stronger international norms to limit the weaponization of space, especially openly offensive weapons in space, to enhance various safety, security measures, right, which align with her sort of broader interest in diplomacy and in global governance. So I think overall, her space policy is likely to continue previous initiatives in lunar exploration, in international cooperation, in space security, in climate-related space missions, in the commercial space sector, right? But she can also emphasize areas such as arms control, especially on an international level more strongly.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of a potential Trump second term, you mentioned a couple of the hallmarks of his space policy in his first term, with reestablishing the National Space Council, standing up the Space Force, and putting the Artemis goals forward. So what do you think a potential second Trump term would look like? Do you think he would do anything like new, or just continue what he started in his first term?
Yeah, so we can expect, right? So if Donald Trump were to serve a second term, we can expect that his space policy would build on the key elements of his first term, although some shifts may occur, considering the fact that Elon Musk will be part of his administration, and as we know, Elon Musk is a big player in the space industry, in the space domain. So I would just outline a few key areas. I'll first point out what he did in the first term and how that may be amplified in his second term. So in his first term, Trump's most notable space policy achievement was the establishment of the U.S. Space Force, right, in 2019 as a separate branch of the U.S. military. And he did that through the Space Policy Directive number 4. So at the time, and still now, the Space Force is framed as critical for ensuring U.S. leadership in space, U.S. dominance in space, in protecting national security against potential threats from China and Russia and other countries in and from space, right? And in doing that, Trump, echoing sort of the narratives and the thoughts of his closer advisors, emphasized space as a warfighting domain, right? And he prioritized the militarization of space and funding space defense systems as part of that. So in his second term, in a potential second term, we can expect that, we may see the continued expansion of the Space Force, right? With increased funding and a greater emphasis on developing advanced space defense technologies. We could also expect a more sort of heightened discourse in terms of, competition vis-a-vis China and Russia. And as a result, we could expect perhaps that the Trump administration may adopt a more assertive stance in space, possibly pushing the boundaries on the deployment of offensive space weapons. So the focus would be the focus could shift from sort of passive deterrence to more active deterrence through demonstrations of technological superiority, which could lead to potential tension in global space governance. In terms of the commercial space sector, we could probably expect more deregulation, right? Because during his first term, Trump strongly supported the growth of the private space sector, and he attempted to reduce various bureaucratic hurdles for private companies through his Space Policy Directive number 2. So we can expect, actually, that in his second term, he would even expand further, right, commercial involvement in more complex missions, such as lunar landings, the Mars missions. Even now, at the current Congress where I am now, very often this question was asked: have we commercialized space too much, right? Because there is such a heavy and extensive, we could see the good effects of the involvement of commercial actors in the space domain, but some are wondering whether this has not gone too much, right? Now, in terms of various exploration missions, in terms of the Moon, Mars, and beyond, during his first term, Trump committed the US to returning astronauts to the Moon by 2024, which is so that's like seven years after he signed the directive. Well, we're still not on the Moon, right? Right now, this deadline is pushed to 2026, and many doubt that we're going to even achieve that deadline because of various issues, including funding, right? However, a second Trump term would likely to continue to prioritize the Artemis program, right, with an even greater focus on maintaining US dominance in lunar exploration and Mars, like going to Mars. But the fact that Elon Musk will be part of his administration, that may actually bring about even more aggressive timelines in terms of going to Mars, right? Even more ambitious projects and more ambitious timelines. Actually, Elon Musk is optimistic that we could launch a spaceship in 2026, which is sort of the next favorable launch window, right, of opportunity to go to Mars, because after that we just have to wait until 2029. Okay, my next point is in terms of international cooperation in space. During the first Trump term, Trump adopted America First approach to space policy, right? Which sometimes strained international partnerships. Because Trump's focus was to maintain US leadership in space rather than fostering multilateral agreements in space. And as I said, his term was marked by heightened rhetoric about space as a domain of strategic competition, particularly vis-a-vis China and Russia. A second term could see Trump sort of intensifying space competition, especially with China, which has made very rapid advancements in its space program. However, there could be selective sort of engagement partnerships in space. We are likely to continue cooperation with close space allies, such as the European allies and Japan. But Trump's focus is going to remain on ensuring that American interests and leadership come first. As a result, he may sort of push allies to increase their investments in space and in US-led initiatives in space, like space situational awareness and cislunar stability and so forth. I would like to also point out something else. So during his first term, let me drink some water, just 1 second. During his first term, Trump issued 4 space policy directives, serving different purposes. So we can expect that during his second term, he could issue new directives focusing on, for example, accelerating space defense spending, accelerating space exploration, expediting Mars expedition, fostering US-led space mining operations, for example, or even creating new frameworks for cislunar security and governance. So he accomplished major milestones in space during his first term by issuing space policy directives, and we can expect that this to continue in his second term.
Thank you so much, Svetla, for a very informative overview of both policy platforms, potential administration objectives. Very informative, more information there than you probably see in the news combined. With space isn't really at the top domestic issue in this election. But one thing I want to go back to is Elon Musk. And a couple of questions that people in our industry, mostly the commercial satellite industry, want to know is that, and I'm going to just go back with what's been reported in the news and in New York Times. Since Elon Musk has been an active political agent since 2022 with the Ron DeSantis campaign, he spent close to $150 million on a political campaign. This is unprecedented for an executive in the space industry. There's no history here of this happening. And then during the campaign, Trump has also hinted that Elon Musk would be running a newly created position tasked with increasing government efficiency. And we know that in the last 2 years, Elon has run into regulatory hurdles, which he has said are retaliation for his political views, whether you believe it or not. He's run into issues with the environment, with FAA, with Starlink, with the FCC. And many in the commercial satellite industry believe that a second Trump term is really an Elon Musk space term in which he determines what our plans are, and that most likely the interests of SpaceX will be looked after first before competitors. Is our industry right to be, or do we have cause for alarm like this? Is there truth to this? Is there a real danger here of the monopoly being established here in commercial space technology?
Yes, there are definitely potential issues because Elon Musk's potential involvement in advising the White House on government efficiency while his company SpaceX competes for government contracts would raise significant ethical and legal concerns, right? Because he would be sort of having a dual role as both a private sector leader and an influential government advisor, right? Which could create conflicts of interest, especially given the fact that SpaceX is heavily involved in various government contracts. Can also create regulatory issues and can also cause concerns within the satellite industry. So if I can just break down those in sort of manageable pieces one by one. First, I would like to discuss what is this conflict of interest, right? So the primary ethical issue here centers exactly on this conflict of interest, or the risk that Musk's position within the government, in the White House, could influence the decisions that benefit his own companies, particularly SpaceX, which often, actually all the time, competes for very lucrative contracts with NASA, the Department of Defense, and various other government agencies, right? So, for example, SpaceX, we all know, has become a major player in providing satellite launch services, crewed space missions, and military payloads, including for the Space Force, but various other entities, receiving billions in contracts from NASA, the Pentagon, etc. So if Musk were advising the government while his company was bidding for and managing these contracts, right, it could raise concerns about whether SpaceX would be given preferential treatment over the competitors. Now, there are government ethics laws, such as Ethics in Government Act, passed actually under Nixon to fight corruption. And such laws seek to prevent officials from benefiting financially from decisions made while they're serving as a public servant, right? So Musk's advisory role actually could put him in a position where he has access to sensitive information about contracting processes, various priorities, various regulatory changes potentially, which could lead to accusations of self-dealing, right? That is using a public position for private gain. And as such, he may need to sign certain documents linked with that, with the government ethics laws, preventing him from such actions like self-dealing actions, right? But I have to say that Musk's influence, so beyond government contracts, right, Musk's influence on regulatory policies could have broader implications for the satellites and space industries, right? So the satellite industry, especially companies involved in launching, building, operating satellites, such as OneWeb or Amazon's Project Kuiper and various others, may fear that actually Musk's advisory position could lead to regulatory bias, right? SpaceX has already faced regulatory issues with various entities, including the FAA, the FCC, over launch licenses and satellite frequency allocation, as you pointed out, right? So as a White House advisor, actually Musk could potentially influence regulatory decisions that favor SpaceX's business model and hamper competitors through various regulatory changes or even delays, right? So that could be one sort of fallout. But in addition to that one, I mean, Musk's company is the leader in the satellite industry through the Starlink project, right? So this dominant role and his advisory role could make competitors worry about whether his influence on government policy could also lead to a distortion in the competitive playing field. For example, policies that regulate space traffic management, orbital debris, satellite frequencies could be used or shaped in such a way that benefits SpaceX, right, at the expense of its competitors. So there are definitely issues in this sort of dual use that Musk may be occupying within the White House. However, Jeffrey, I would like to point out that this is not to say that Musk cannot serve as an advisor or in an advisory role in the new administration, right? For Musk's role to be ethically viable, there must be some strict sort of safeguards put in place, right, to avoid conflicts of interest, to avoid regulatory uncertainties, and to ensure transparency, basically. So some of those measures could include, for example, I'm just going to throw some out there, but recusal. So Musk could formally recuse himself from any discussions or decisions that directly impact SpaceX or any other company in which he holds a substantial financial interest, right? This is necessary so to make sure that he does not leverage his government position to favor his own businesses. That's number one. So he can recuse himself. Number two, another solution could be for Musk to divest from SpaceX, or at least to place his holdings in a blind trust, like while serving as a government advisor. Now, will he do that? This is highly problematic and uncertain. as I mentioned before, he most likely will be asked to sign ethics agreements, right, overseen by the Office of Government Ethics to prevent conflicts of interests. And such agreements usually specify which areas a person, in this case Musk, would need to avoid in order to not to influence or not to abuse his involvement in the government and his company and the companies and his companies.
Yeah, I think that's a very thorough rundown of all of the different types of concerns that such a position would come with. And it's hard to imagine there being any sort of space policy that wouldn't merit a recusal because of how involved SpaceX is in satellite operations, launching satellites, crewed missions. It's the company has so, and military use of space, it's just has such a large impact across the industry. Those are a very good overview of concerns, and those things they're extremely concerning, at least to me.
And when I hear you walk through them, I imagine all of the lawsuits that are going to happen. Is when you're walking through every step of that, I'm like, that's another lawsuit. That's another lawsuit. It could really jam things up for not just the industry, but for him personally, right?
Yeah, Jeffrey, and Rachel, those are great points. Actually, Musk's position might really lead to increased regulatory scrutiny if various competitors raise concerns about unfair practices and abuse of power, right? Which could lead to lawsuits, investigations by Congress or various government agencies, pushback by industry groups advocating for, more regulation, and so forth. So this could sort of, if there is no transparency or some stricter rules in place to limit that impact, we may see sort of various secondary and tertiary effects of this situation.
With Musk, he's been very, very political, especially in the Trump campaign. And space overall has had increasing politicization in the last decade, where it used to be broadly bipartisan. Do you think that increasing polarization is a risk to the U.S. long-term interest in space?
Yes. Sorry, I was still on the first question, but generally, the increasing political.
Thank you for being with us. I know it's late in Italy.
No, it's 9 o'clock, and I've been up since 4 o'clock, going to various sessions. But this is an excellent question, and I have to say the increasing politicization, but the increasing politicizing of space over the last decade actually does present risks to U.S. long-term interest in space in particular, right? So one of the most immediate risks of politicizing space is this lack of policy continuity across the different administrations, which I mentioned. We all know that anything that goes in space, that happens in space, takes years, right? And one administration usually lasts 4 years, if we are lucky, 8 years, right? But so historically, there has been bipartisan support for space programs like Apollo, the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, which has allowed for long-term planning and stable funding, right? However, if and when space policy becomes politicized, shifts in political power can actually lead to abrupt changes in direction, which can undermine long-term strategic goals, right? For example, the Obama administration actually canceled the Constellation program, which was initiated under President George W. Bush, and instead focused on commercial partnerships and the asteroid mission, which was later scrapped by the Trump administration in favor of something else. Trump then prioritized lunar exploration through the Artemis program, while a Biden administration maintained the Artemis but adjusted the various timelines and the funding priorities, right? So there is always this constant changes really risk wasting resources, delaying critical milestones, reducing trust in US leadership, and eventually not even allowing to reach the intended goals and wasting all those resources that had been invested until then, right? So politicization can lead to varying levels of funding for space programs based on political priorities. For example, funding for NASA, the Space Force, or commercial space initiatives may fluctuate depending on which party is in power, which can impact long-term planning, can slow down critical projects that actually require sustained investment over decades, can even, fracture the public's trust in the space program, can also undermine the trust of our allies in our own capabilities to follow through. So it can be manifested in so many negative impacts on the space, in the space domain, that it can fracture U.S. leadership's, U.S. priorities in space, and U.S. operations in space in really unforeseeable ways, even though we can actually foresee some of those. I just want to say, in terms of national security, right? The increased politicization of space, particularly around military and defense uses, could actually introduce national security risks. For example, the creation of the U.S. Space Force under President Trump, while essential for national security, actually at the time, and still is sometimes, it became a highly politicized issue, right? Now, the Biden administration actually maintained the Space Force. However, future administrations could either scale back or expand it based on political priorities, which could lead to inconsistent approaches to space defense. It can weaken U.S. deterrence in and from space, and could allow adversaries to take advantages and exploit any sort of perceived lack of commitment, right? So I don't know if we have time, but internationally, politicizing space issues can also have disastrous impacts. It could weaken U.S. leadership in shaping international norms and rules governing space. As the U.S. becomes more internally divided on space policy, its ability to lead, to define norms, and to influence the international community on space issues will diminish, right? Right now, there are really some really pressing issues in terms of defining, for example, what is a space resource, what exactly we can mine on the moon, like resource extraction, how to manage the traffic that will increase in cislunar space, etc., right? All those require actually long-term diplomatic engagement internationally and consistent policies. But politicizing space may actually cause the US to lose credibility in advocating for responsible space behavior, right? Especially if different administrations alternate between cooperation and competition with global rivals like China and Russia. So just to summarize, there are several other aspects how this can impact our US capabilities in space. But generally, politicizing space presents significant risks to the U.S. long-term interest in space.
Well, thank you so much, Svetla, for joining us and talking about both platforms and giving us some what I think is very objective information about the continuity between administrations going back to Trump, then to Biden, how that could continue from 2024 to 2028. I really appreciate you sharing that information with us and for talking about what could possibly change. And thank you, Rachel, for having me on with you as well.
Yeah, thank you both. It's great to talk about this so in depth because it's not the issue that gets, or nor should it get, the most attention in a presidential campaign in the national media, but it is really important for the space industry and international space community. So it's important to talk about.